It begins with a single sound, one voice, one word, one language rolling like a river over the whole earth. Imagine it, a world without translation, without misunderstanding, where a thought born in one mind could travel unbroken into another, and yet that harmony carried a secret shadow. Some say this was the age of perfect unity, others call it the age of perfect pride. In one telling, the people built together because they loved one another. In another, they built because they wanted to climb above the heavens. And in yet another, this whole chapter of history is barely spoken of, replaced by other legends of humanity's first rebellion. The city they built was not enough. The tower they planned was not just stone, it was a statement. One tradition says they feared another flood and wanted a refuge beyond the reach of the waters. Another says they wanted to dethrone God. And another asks a strange question: what if they only wanted to keep the world together so no one would ever be lost to distant lands? If that is true, then what happened next was not punishment, but protection. But how do you protect people from themselves? One vision speaks of God stepping down, looking upon the city, and scattering its builders with a wave of divine will. Another speaks of angels descending, twisting tongues, until friends became strangers overnight. Another claims that heaven did nothing at all, that the tower fell because human ambition was too heavy to stand. Still, the questions rise higher than any bricks ever did. If heaven feared human power, can heaven fear at all? If heaven wished to guard humanity, why strike so suddenly, without warning? And if the goal was to spread people across the earth, why create them united in the first place? Some say the tower was finished, but cursed. Some say it cracked before its crown reached the clouds. Some even say it still stands, buried in dust, somewhere in the deserts between rivers, waiting for a time when human voices will dare to rise together again. What is certain is this: when the sun rose over the city of Babel, one people stood together. When it set, they could no longer understand one another. The sound of one language became the noise of many, and from that moment, the world was never the same. If the tower was torn down to humble humanity, then it was an act of judgment. But if it was torn down to save humanity, then it was an act of mercy. The stones do not speak, and the voices that remain tell different stories. So we stand at the foot of the invisible ruins, the air still heavy with the echo of countless tongues, each telling a different truth. Which one will you believe? And more importantly, was the tower destroyed to humble us or to save us from ourselves? The plain was wide and fertile, stretching like a green sea beneath a sky that seemed close enough to touch. People moved across it like waves, gathering at the heart of the land. They spoke the same words. They dreamed the same dreams. There was no barrier between thought and speech, no confusion between heart and heart. In that unity, they found a strange hunger, not for more land, but for more sky. Some say it began with a whisper, a simple idea shared among neighbors. Others say it was the order of a king, but once spoken, the plan took root. They would build a city. They would build a tower, not just any tower, but one that would pierce the clouds. Some tell it as the first great monument of rebellion against God. Others insist it was a desperate act of security, a shield against the memory of a flood that had once drowned the world. And in one tradition, the project was not rebellion or fear, but ambition, the desire to keep humanity together, one people under one name. The clay of the plain was rich, the soil thick. They shaped bricks with their hands, burning them hard in fire until they shone like sunlit stone. They mixed bitumen for mortar, their fingers blackened with the tar. In some versions, the work was holy, a symbol of unity. In others, it was cursed from the moment the first brick was laid. And in still others, the entire story is shifted. The tower is not mentioned, but the heart of the people is still described as proud. As the walls rose, so did their voices. Orders were given, songs were sung, plans were drawn in dust. The people worked without confusion, each knowing exactly what the other meant. Their steps were as one. The tower began to take on a shape that no one could ignore. Farmers from far-off fields came to see it. Traders from other lands stared in awe. It became not just a building, but a statement to the world. Here is the power of human hands. But there is a question at the root of every telling. Did they build to reach heaven or to replace it? In one faith, they sought to climb into the realm of God Himself. In another, they built to protect themselves from what God might do again. In another still, the tower was simply the human spirit made into stone, a monument to our refusal to scatter. This is where the story sharpens. If their unity was good, why would heaven oppose it? If their unity was dangerous, why did heaven allow them to begin at all? In one version, God waited until the tower rose high enough to be seen across the horizon, until the people could taste their victory. In another, the delay was not hesitation, but patience, allowing human pride to reveal its full shape before the blow fell. And as the shadow of the tower stretched across the plain, no one imagined it could fall. The people believed they had found a way to hold the world in one place. But in the sky above, the decision was forming, a decision that would break the earth's single voice into 1,000 fragments. The last bricks of defiance were being laid, and the hands that placed them had no idea how quickly their words would turn to confusion. If the tower was a threat, why did heaven wait until it was nearly complete? Morning came soft and gold across the plain. Smoke from the brick kilns drew thin lines in the air. The tower stood like a spear of earth lifted toward the blue. Workers woke to the same old rhythm. They tied cloth at their waists. They dampened clay. They sang the simple work songs they all knew. Every mouth shaped every word the same way. The sound of the city was one voice, steady as a drum. The day began as all days had begun. Plans were clear. Bricks would rise. Leaders would walk the scaffolds and point, and crews would move as one body. Mothers would carry water. Children would chase the shadows of the tower across the ground and laugh. On that morning, nobody feared that the world could shatter, but stories tell that the world can change in one breath, and on this morning, the breath came. Some tell it like a gentle step. Heaven looked down and drew near. The light shifted as if the sky leaned closer to the earth. Others tell it like a storm that did not need wind. The air turned heavy. The birds paused in their flight. A hush spread over the city like the moment before rain. In that hush, something invisible touched human speech. At first, a mason called for a bucket. He had always called it the same way. The word should have flown from his mouth and landed in his friend's mind like a stone in a basket. But the friend frowned. He heard a sound he had never heard before. He handed a chisel. The mason stared. He tried again, louder now, and his friend shook his head, puzzled and a little afraid. Another worker laughed and offered a rope. Soon 10 men were speaking, and not one answer fit any question. Laughter turned to anger. Anger turned to fear. The song of the city broke into pieces. In Judaism, the fall into many tongues is told as a moral cut to human pride. One voice had grown tall, and so it was sliced into many voices. The confusion was not random. It was a teaching. The city had tried to make a name that crowded out the name above every name, so their own names fell apart upon their lips. In Christianity, the same turning point becomes a mirror held up to the heart. The single tongue had carried the power to do great harm or great good, and its shattering exposed desire that had risen too high. People who wanted to climb past heaven were forced to face each other on the ground. In Islam, the scene is a sign of order returning to a world drifting toward disorder. Unity, when tied to arrogance, is not safety but danger. The change of speech did not come from panic in the sky, but from wisdom that sees farther than any human plan. 3 tellings point to 1 hour, and yet the reason they give for that hour cuts 3 different paths. On the scaffolds, orders twisted into riddles. A foreman raised both hands and shouted for all to hold the line. The crew heard only broken fragments of sound, as if the wind played with his mouth. They looked to each other for help and found only strangers' faces in neighbors' eyes. A woman called to her child. The child turned toward her sound, but did not know it was his name. The mother cried again, this time with tears, using the same name she had sung for years, and the child froze because the noise was new and sharp and wrong. Fear moved through the streets like a cold shadow. In Judaism, some tell that the division of tongues also divided crafts and trades. People who once worked the same clay now could not agree on the shape of a brick. Labor itself became language. The city that tried to fit all life into one plan learned that work cannot live without meaning, and meaning rests in words. In Christianity, the confusion reveals how fragile human unity is when it rests on pride. If the center of a people is their own monument, then the first crack of pride turns into 1,000 cracks of speech. In Islam, the scattering is guarded by a lesson about leadership. When leaders call people toward a path that rises on arrogance, the mercy of God may block the road, even if that mercy stings like loss. 3 lamps light the same hallway. We see the same walls, but we notice different doors. From the tower's high walkways, men looked out at the wide land and felt very small for the first time. They had believed the tower made the earth theirs. Now they could not make sense of a neighbor's sentence. The stone pulleys squealed, carts tipped. A kiln fire burned too hot because the command to cool it arrived in a tongue the stoker had never heard. A single afternoon undid years of planning. Pride had built a ladder into the sky, and now simple words could not climb a stair. There were those who blamed the leaders. Some said a king had dared to name himself greater than heaven, and that his boast pulled the punishment down like lightning. Others said there was no king at all, only a crowd that became its own throne. In Judaism, pride often takes the shape of a ruler who leads people to forget humility. In Christianity, pride is a disease that travels through every heart, ruler and worker alike, so the cure touches every mouth. In Islam, the moral weight falls on intention. If the aim is to rival the Creator, the project cannot stand, no matter who signs the plan. 3 mirrors, 3 angles, 1 face beneath. Confusion grew teeth. In the market, buyers and sellers shouted with empty hands held high. A man offered grain and received stones. A woman asked for water and was given salt. An elder tried to calm them, and his voice, once trusted by all, sounded to some like music and to others like a storm. When the mouth lost its bridge, the heart lost its road. Frustration sparked into quarrels. Quarrels flared into blows. The city of one voice became a square full of noise, each sound arguing with the next. In Judaism, the moment of many tongues carries a warning about the power of unity without goodness. A single language can build a single crime. In Christianity, It becomes a slow sadness that reveals our need for grace. We cannot keep ourselves together by our own cleverness. We need a love larger than plans and bricks. In Islam, it is a boundary line carved by mercy. Diversity of speech is not a wound to be healed at any cost. It is a sign that keeps the earth from marching under one arrogant banner. Here we hear at least 3 contradictions singing side by side. Was the act a punishment or a protection? Was the crowd guilty as one body or broken because each heart chose pride? Was unity the dream to chase or the danger to avoid? The same hour holds 3 answers and all point to the same sky. By evening, the scaffold stood empty. Torches burned along the base of the tower, but the light fell on faces that could not agree on the simplest things. People began to draw circles in the dust with sticks. They pointed to food and spoke new sounds. They tapped their chests and said names that nobody recognized. Small groups slowly found tiny islands of meaning. A family could speak to itself. A cluster of neighbors could trade a little. But the sea between groups grew wider with every sentence. The city's heart broke into smaller hearts. Stories differ on how sudden the break was. In Judaism, it is often pictured as swift, like a blade cutting through rope. The lesson hits hard because the danger was great. In Christianity, some storytellers allow for a slow dawning, a day that began bright and ended in gray, with panic turning to grief as the sun went down. In Islam, the change needs no long drama. It is an act that happens because the one who orders the world decided that this was the right hour. These differences matter. They shape how we feel about the builder of the sky. Do we see a judge, quick to cut? Do we see a teacher, patient to unfold a lesson? Do we see a guardian, clear and firm? By night, the tower cast a long black finger against the stars. Under that shadow, campfires flickered in circles. People brought out tools and blankets. They placed them in piles that made sense to them and no one else. The word for water was now 10 words. The word for home was now 20. Lovers tried to say comfort and found they could only say silence. Friends tried to say hope and found only the shape of their hands. In Judaism, some say the builders faced more than loss. Their work became not only useless but dangerous. A cart of bricks could crush a foot because a warning could not be understood. The city that had hoped to touch heaven now feared its own afternoon. In Christianity, the sorrow of Babel becomes a kind of doorway that will one day swing the other way. If speech can be broken, then speech can be healed, but not by pride. It will take a gift that comes down, not a ladder that goes up. In Islam, the end of the work is simple and complete. What was not permitted cannot be finished. The people do not defeat heaven, heaven decides, and wise people accept this and go their separate ways under that wisdom. 3 threads, 3 textures, 1 cloth of meaning. The next morning, leaders tried to regain control. They climbed halfway up the tower and shouted commands in every direction. Crews looked up with empty eyes. Some leaders wept. Some leaders raged. Others, seeing the shape of what had happened, sat down and covered their heads. Brick stacks dried in the sun and began to crack. The kilns cooled. The pulleys hung still. What had seemed unstoppable now looked like a broken toy left in the dust by a child who had grown bored. In the arguments that followed, people asked hard questions that still echo. If heaven did this, was it because heaven was afraid of human power? In Judaism, the answer leans toward no. Heaven does not fear, heaven teaches. The division of tongues is a wall built for our good, not a shield raised in panic. In Christianity, the answer also turns away from fear. The true danger was not height, but heart. The cure reaches the place where pride begins. In Islam, the very idea that the Most High could fear is set aside. What happened was not defense. It was decree. 3 faiths, 1 rejection of fear, yet each with its own way of naming the cause. A strange quiet settled over the days that followed. Without shared words, large plans fell apart. A people who had been one body loosened at the joints. Some gathered their goods and moved toward the setting sun. Others turned their faces toward mountains in the north. Others followed rivers south until the land opened like a hand. The tower did not fall that week, but its purpose did. A building without a purpose is a husk. Before they left, some stood at the base and pressed a palm against the brick, as if to feel the old dream still warm in the wall. They could not name the feeling anymore, but they knew it was heavy. Some felt anger, some felt shame, some felt relief, like waking from a fever dream. Difference settled like dust on their shoulders, and they were surprised to find that they could still walk. In Judaism, the scattering that follows is tied to a story of families and nations. The split of speech becomes the seed of peoples. The map of the earth grows from the shards of one tongue. In Christianity, the scattering points forward as much as backward. The broken words make us long for a day when the message of peace can leap across languages without being trapped by pride. In Islam, the spread of peoples is part of a wider plan that was always larger than one city. The earth was meant to be filled. The languages that now bloom like many flowers are not mistakes. They are signs and verses written into human life. 3 paths again, 1 horizon. Some say angels were seen at the edge of sight that day, not with swords, but with calm faces, keeping watch as people packed and walked. In Judaism, angels can serve as messengers of judgment as well as mercy, and here they would be witnesses to both. In Christianity, angels often mark turning points, but the deeper turn is inward, where pride bends or breaks. In Islam, angels act only by command, and if they were present, their presence would reflect the order of God, not a struggle in the sky. The stories touch the same mystery from different sides. Did hands from heaven touch the lips of the earth, or did a single will speak and the world obey? Children learned new lullabies that week. Mothers taught them the sounds that belonged to their little circle and shrugged when the children asked why other children sang different songs. Fathers tested the edges of their neighbors' words with long, patient efforts, but patience ran thin when the goats needed water and the fields called. Slowly, the city softened and opened, like a fruit splitting into pieces. The seed of each new people fell to a different ground. At night, the stars were unchanged. People felt a strange comfort in that. The same lights that had watched the tower rise now watched it stand still. The same constellations that could not be reached by bricks also could not be broken by voices. The sky was like a witness who says, "I saw it all, and I am not moved." Earthly noise fades in the open air. We are left with questions that cannot be stacked like bricks. In Judaism, what began as a proud plan ends as a lesson carved into history. Greatness without humility breeds harm. In Christianity, the broken speech becomes the stage on which a future unity will be a gift, not a grab. In Islam, the event is a boundary set by wisdom, and the beauty of many tongues becomes a sign to be respected. The contradictions are not small. Is division a curse or a mercy? Is unity always good or only good when it bows? Was the tower almost a victory or always a mistake? The answers do not cancel each other. They hold us under the same sky and make us listen. As the last families stepped away, they turned and looked once more at the tower. It seemed taller now that it would never be finished, because imagination kept building where hands had stopped. The wind threaded through the empty scaffolds and made a low moan. Some heard a warning in that sound. Some heard a song. Some heard nothing at all, only the noise of a project that had lost its meaning. The descent of confusion did not end with that day. It began there and walked with the people into the valleys and deserts and coasts. It shaped their myths, their jokes, their prayers, their quarrels. Languages grew like trees, strong and different, each with its own fruit and shade. And in the quiet of the night, elders told children of a time when the world had one voice, and the children widened their eyes and asked if that was good or bad, and the elders even then could not give a single answer. So we close this day in the city where words broke. The kiln fires are ash, the pulleys hang still, the last echo of a single tongue fades into the hush of many. Tomorrow, the walking will begin. The compass will be drawn by memory, fear, hope, and the pull of rivers. The tower will watch them go and learn how small a giant feels when its builders turn their backs. Was the scattering of nations an act of mercy or a curse that the earth still carries? Walk with me to the next horizon, where the travelers take their first steps away from the city, and we will listen to the sound of the scattered earth. They left in clusters, not as one stream but as many small rivers breaking from a single spring. The plain of Shinar slowly emptied. The sound of voices no longer blended into one song. It scattered into patches, each with its own rhythm. Some walked with the rising sun behind them, seeking the cool shadows of mountains. Others followed the winding lines of rivers, chasing water into far valleys. Others turned their faces toward wide open deserts where the horizons seemed to have no end. The city that had been their center grew smaller in the distance, the tower still spearing the sky like a question mark. For days, some turned back at night to look at it, even when it was only a shape in the haze. They did not speak the same words anymore, but their silence agreed. Something had ended. What they had built together was now a relic they had abandoned. And yet, in each group, the story of why they left began to take a different shape. In Judaism, the scattering becomes the start of the nations, each with its own identity born from this fracture. In Christianity, it is the moment humanity is reminded that we cannot build our way to heaven by our own design. In Islam, it is a planned unfolding, a moment in the larger map of history where people take the places they were always meant to fill. One moment, three meanings, all carried away in different tongues. The walk was not easy. Groups lost their bearings without the constant exchange of ideas they once had. A tool that had been common knowledge to build could no longer be made in a new land because the people who knew how to shape it now spoke a language no one nearby understood. Fields were planted in different ways. Houses were built with strange roofs. Each new settlement bore the mark of both memory and adaptation. Over time, the tower in the plain faded from view, but the difference in speech, in customs, in ways of living, that stayed. In some versions, the scattering was swift and complete, the people moving so far from each other that no meeting was possible for generations. In others, the separation was slower, like colors bleeding apart on wet cloth, until each shade was distinct. The three faiths do not fully agree on whether the scattering was a sudden blow or a gradual unfolding, but all agree that the result reshaped the world forever. As the new settlements grew, pride found its way into new forms. A people would look at their language and see it as the purest. Another would see theirs as the most clever, another as the most beautiful. The unity that had been shattered at Babel was not replaced with humility. It was replaced with new walls, invisible but tall. In Judaism, this tendency is part of the human struggle. Even divine lessons are not always learned as intended. In Christianity, it shows the depth of the wound Babel left in the human heart. In Islam, It reveals how diversity itself can be a mercy, but pride can still twist it into rivalry. Yet even as rivalries formed, beauty bloomed, words grew into new songs. The same story of the tower was told in different accents, painted with different details. In one village, it was told as a warning to never reach too high. In another, it was told as a reminder that unity must serve something greater than itself. In another, it became a tale of how God's wisdom saved humanity from its own excess. The same event became many lessons, shaped by many tongues. Travelers sometimes crossed paths. When they did, they would trade goods, gestures, and laughter without sharing words. They would point to the sky and draw a rough shape of the tower in the dust. The other would nod, and for a moment, the distance between them felt smaller. In those moments, it was as if the scattering had not fully erased the memory of one voice, only buried it under layers of difference. Generations passed, and the tower's ruins became a mystery. Some descendants of the builders heard that their ancestors had been punished. Others heard they had been protected. Others heard nothing at all, and the tower became just another ruin of the old world. But still, when they saw a mountain or a great temple, they wondered if someone, somewhere, might one day build high enough to touch the clouds again. The plain of Shinar no longer echoed with one sound. It had been replaced by the hum of countless villages spread across the earth. The scattering had done its work, and yet, in the quiet of the night, when elders told the story of how they came to live in their place, the tower always returned. It was not just a memory of bricks and bitumen, it was a question. If God wanted humanity to spread, why unite them in the first place? Walk with me now, away from the voices of those who left, into the deserts and ruins where stones still rise from the sand. Some claim these are the remains of the real Babel. Others say the true tower is still lost beneath time. What ancient ruins, if any, are the true Babel? The desert does not speak quickly. Its voice is slow, carried in the wind that shapes the dunes, in the silence between the cries of hawks, in the way the heat bends the horizon into a wavering dream. Somewhere between two rivers, in a land once thick with cities, lie stones that some call the bones of Babel. They rise from the dust in broken lines, stairways that lead nowhere, walls that stop mid-breath. The locals give them names older than memory. The travelers give them names pulled from holy stories. And the scholars give them names written on their maps in neat, careful ink. One name appears often in the search for Babel Etemenanki. It means the house of the foundation of heaven and earth. Its ruins sit in what was once Babylon in modern Iraq. Archaeologists say it was a ziggurat, a stepped tower of mud, brick, and bitumen, 7 levels rising toward the sky. Some scholars see in it the shape of the tower told in sacred texts. Others dismiss the link, saying the dating is wrong, the purpose different, the story too tangled to tie to one place. But to the pilgrim who stands at its base and looks up at the sun, the doubt fades. They see a tower that once reached higher than any other, and they remember the story. In Judaism, Etemenanki is sometimes mentioned as a possible echo of Babel, but with caution. The memory of the tower is not pinned to one ruin. It is a warning woven into the fabric of history. In Christianity, some teachers point to Babylon's great ziggurat as a shadow of the original tower, a symbol of human pride reborn in another age. In Islam, the search for the physical tower is less urgent. The lesson of Babel does not depend on bricks, and its location, whether known or hidden, does not change the wisdom it carries. 3 views stand in the same wind. One seeks the place, one warns of the pattern, one says the place is less than the purpose. Not all who hunt Babel look to Etemenanki. Some search further south, in the ruins of Ur, where ziggurats rise from the plain like the backs of ancient beasts. Others point east, towards Susa and Elam, where forgotten temples crumble into the desert. A few even look far beyond Mesopotamia, claiming that Babel's memory traveled and was rebuilt in other lands. Every ruin with height becomes a candidate. Every pile of bricks in the desert becomes a question mark. Archaeologists dig for clues, layers of ash, inscriptions in cuneiform, traces of bitumen in the joints. Each find becomes a thread in the tapestry of speculation. Some argue that the story of Babel grew from many towers, not one, each with its own tale of ambition and fall. If that is true, then Babel is less a place and more a pattern, one repeated wherever human hands reach too high. Yet the ruins whisper other possibilities. What if Babel's tower still stands, buried under sand, its top broken but its base intact? What if the desert is not erasing it but hiding it, guarding it until the day it is meant to be seen again? In Judaism, such a thought might be a caution that pride could rise again if the ruins were restored. In Christianity, it could be a reminder that the heart of Babel lives on, whether or not the stones are found. In Islam, it could be irrelevant. The tower's fate is sealed, its purpose finished, its lesson complete. The debate grows hotter when new discoveries surface. A mud brick foundation uncovered after a sandstorm. A cuneiform tablet speaking of a king who gathered all peoples to build a great tower. A carving of men carrying bricks in lines that wind toward the sky. Some scholars lean forward eagerly, others shake their heads. Without proof, the ruins are only ruins. With proof, they are still just stones, unless you already believe. Travelers tell of standing among the ruins at dusk, when the air cools and the sky bleeds gold into purple. They say the stones seem to hum in the silence, as if remembering the voices that once echoed there. The wind moves over the bricks like a whisper in many tongues. Perhaps it is only the shape of the stones catching the breeze. Or perhaps the memory of Babel is still here, waiting for someone to listen. Which leaves the question hanging like a star over the desert. If the tower's location is still in dispute, can its morals still be trusted? Or does the absence of proof weaken the story's claim? The ruins cannot answer. But there is another trail to follow, one that leads not through stone, but through blood, to a man whose name is tangled with Babel's rise. Did Nimrod's ambition ignite the dream of the tower? Long before the first brick of the tower was set, there was a man whose shadow stretched across the plains. His name was Nimrod. To some, he was a king, mighty in power and bold in vision. To others, he was a tyrant whose ambition reached higher than the heavens themselves. His story drifts between history and legend, wrapped in contradictions that have followed him for thousands of years. In Judaism, Nimrod is remembered as a mighty hunter before the Lord, a phrase that some read as honor and others as defiance. Some say he was a rebel king who sought to turn humanity's heart away from God, gathering the people under his rule not for their safety, but for his glory. In Christianity, he often becomes the archetype of human pride, a ruler who inspired the building of the tower, not out of fear of another flood, but to rival the throne of heaven. In Islam, Nimrod appears in stories as a king who opposed a prophet, defying the message of truth with arrogance and power. Yet in some Islamic traditions, he is absent from Babel entirely, his name tied to other acts of defiance instead. One man, three portraits, ruler, rebel, symbol. The question of Nimrod's role in Babel is as much about motive as it is about power. If he was the architect of the project, what drove him? Was it a desire to unify humanity under one rule, to protect them from a second disaster, or to lift himself so high that even God would take notice? The faiths differ in their answers. Judaism often frames him as a challenger to divine authority, gathering the people in an act of collective rebellion. Christianity tends to see him as the spark that lit the fire of human pride, turning unity into idolatry. Islam, in some accounts, paints him as a man who saw the prophets as rivals and tried to outshine them with monuments to his own name. Legends outside the scriptures stretch his story even further. Some say Nimrod was the first to wear a crown. Others say he invented the art of hunting and ruled over vast lands from the Tigris to the Nile. Still others place him in battles against giants or angels. These stories may be history wrapped in myth or myth dressed as history, but all agree Nimrod was no ordinary man. The builders of the tower, in some tellings, were driven by his vision. He convinced them that together, speaking one language, they could achieve anything, even touch the sky. In one tradition, he told the people that the flood had been sent by God to weaken them, and that if another came, they must be ready to save themselves without relying on heaven. In another, he promised that if they reached high enough, they could challenge God directly. In a third, his role is less about divine rivalry and more about securing his reign by keeping the people close, afraid to scatter into lands where his rule would fade. Archaeologists have never found proof of Nimrod as a single historical figure. Some suggest his name could be a title representing more than one king. Others think he may be a memory of Sumerian or Akkadian rulers whose deeds were later folded into one legend. If that is true, then Nimrod is less a man than a symbol, the human drive to rule, to gather, to control, to climb. But for those who believe he was real, the ruins of ancient cities tell his story in stone. Some point to Babylon as his capital, others to Nineveh. Some even claim he built both, laying the foundation for empires that would rise and fall for centuries. The truth is buried deep, and perhaps it is meant to be. For Nimrod's power in the story of Babel is not in what we can prove, but in what we cannot forget, the idea that one person can set the whole world on a path toward the heavens, whether for good or for ruin. And so the question lingers in the hot wind of the plain. Was Nimrod the father of Babel's dream, or has his name been stitched into the story by later hands? If he existed, where is the proof of his kingdom, his crown, his tower? The answers may be lost to time, but there is another question waiting just ahead, whether the fall of Babel was born from heaven's fear or from man's folly. High above the plain, the tower's shadow reached farther each day. To the builders, it was a sign of progress, of their growing strength. But to those who tell the story in different tongues, it was also a sign of danger. The heart of the debate has never been about the bricks themselves, but about the reason heaven acted at all. Was the scattering of tongues born from divine fear of human power or from the folly of human pride? In Judaism, the question turns toward the nature of God. Can the Creator be afraid of his own creation? Many say no, that what some call fear is better understood as concern, as judgment, as the wise refusal to let a dangerous path run its full course. Humanity had been given unity, but unity without humility was a weapon. The tower was not stopped because it threatened heaven's throne, but because it threatened the goodness of the earth. In Christianity, the answer follows a similar road. God does not fear humanity in the way a man fears an enemy. Rather, God knows the harm humanity can cause when united in arrogance. The confusion of tongues becomes an act of mercy disguised as a barrier, a way to save humanity from the harm it might inflict upon itself. In Islam, the very idea that God could feel fear is rejected outright. God's will is supreme. The scattering was not reaction, but decree, a planned moment in the order of history. And yet, the way the story is told in each faith carries a different emotional weight. In some Jewish traditions, the scene is one of quick intervention, almost like a parent pulling a child away from fire. In Christian telling, it can carry the sorrow of watching someone choose a path that will harm them, then stepping in before it is too late. In Islam, it is firm, decisive, unquestionable, not born of worry, but of authority. Outside the sacred texts, some interpreters lean into the image of a God who fears humanity's potential. They point to the phrase, "Nothing will be impossible for them," and hear a note of alarm. In their view, the tower is a metaphor for technology, for advancement, for the human ability to reshape the world. To them, Babel is a warning that too much power in one hand, even the hand of the entire human race, can lead to disaster. Others argue that this is a misreading, that the true fear in the story is human fear. Fear of being scattered, fear of losing control, fear of needing to depend on the one who made them. The bricks themselves tell a silent version of the story. Each one was shaped by fire, hardened against the rain. Each was set in place with the strength of many hands. If you imagine the tower complete, rising into the clouds, it is easy to see how it could become a symbol too heavy for its makers. The higher it climbed, the more it could feed the lie that humanity could stand without heaven. In Judaism, this is the heart of the folly, thinking that the gift of unity belonged to the people rather than to the giver. In Christianity, it is the classic shape of sin, turning a good thing into a godless thing. In Islam, it is the crossing of a line drawn by divine wisdom, a step into territory that was never meant for creation. Some philosophers have asked whether God's action at Babel was defensive or preventive. Did heaven act because the tower had already crossed a threshold, or because it would have, given time? The answer shifts with the storyteller. In Judaism, the intervention feels like a measured strike. The tower had reached a moral height that could no longer be ignored. In Christianity, the act is preventive, stopping pride before it could bring greater ruin. In Islam, it is neither fear nor prevention in human terms, but the fulfillment of a divine plan that always included the scattering. Perhaps the clearest clue lies in what happened after. The people were not destroyed, only divided. The tower was not burned to the ground, only abandoned. This was not the flood with its sweeping destruction. It was a quieter judgment, one that left life intact but changed its shape forever. If fear had been the motive, destruction might have been total. If folly was the cause, then correction, not annihilation, was the right answer. The tension between these two ideas, heaven's fear or man's folly, keeps the story alive in every generation. Each interpretation changes the way we see God and ourselves. Is the divine role one of guarding the heavens from invasion or of guarding humanity from itself? Is the human role one of daring ambition or of dangerous arrogance? And yet there is another thread woven into the story, one that reaches back before the first brick was laid. Some say the shadow of Babel begins not in the city's foundations, but in the memory of the flood. That ancient disaster still haunted the minds of those who built, shaping their reasons, their fears, and their hopes. Could it be that Babel's story cannot be told without the flood's long shadow? Before there was Babel, there was water, endless, rising, swallowing the mountains themselves. The flood was more than a story to the people of the plain. It was a wound carved into memory. Generations after the waters receded, its shadow still lay across the earth. Children grew up hearing how the world had been washed clean. Elders told of the ark, of the chosen survivors, of the day the rain stopped and the sun returned. But they also spoke of the loss, of the countless lives ended, of the cities erased as if they had never been. The flood was a reminder of both divine judgment and divine rescue, and it was this memory, some say, that shaped the foundations of Babel. In Judaism, the link between the flood and the tower is often drawn through family lines. The builders of Babel were the descendants of Noah, men and women who carried the story in their blood. The unity of one language was their inheritance, but so was the fear of being swept away again. Some rabbis teach that the tower was not just rebellion, but resistance, a way to ensure survival without depending on heaven. In Christianity, the flood is the backdrop that reveals the deeper issue. Humanity had been given a fresh start, yet the same pride rose again. Babel becomes the proof that a new world does not mean a new heart. In Islam, the two events are part of a greater unfolding. The flood was a test of obedience. The scattering at Babel was another, each serving a purpose in the divine plan. Some traditions tell that the tower was designed as a refuge. If the waters ever returned, the people could climb high enough to escape. The bitumen that sealed the bricks was chosen not only for strength, but for water resistance. The tower's height was not just a reach for heaven, but a shield against the sea. In this view, Babel was less an act of arrogance and more an act of mistrust, a refusal to believe the promise that the flood would not come again. Others reject this entirely. They say the tower had nothing to do with fear of water and everything to do with pride. In this telling, the flood is relevant only as a sign that humanity forgets quickly. The same God who had spared a remnant was now being challenged by those who thought themselves untouchable. In Judaism, this becomes a lesson in how quickly gratitude can fade. In Christianity, it is a picture of how sin survives every fresh start. In Islam, it is a reminder that without guidance, humanity will drift back toward corruption, no matter how many warnings are given. The flood's shadow also shaped the way people saw God. For some, it inspired awe and obedience. For others, it planted suspicion. If heaven had once judged the earth so severely, who could say it would not happen again? The tower in that light was insurance. But insurance against whom? Against the Creator who made the earth. This is where the story becomes heavy with contradiction. If the flood taught the need to trust God, why did it also inspire a project that seemed to reject that trust? If the flood taught humility, why did it end in another act of human self-reliance? The survivors, descendants, may have stood at the base of the tower and thought of the ark's beams, the endless rain, the cries of those left outside. They may have told themselves they were building safety, but safety without faith can harden into defiance. In Judaism, that defiance takes the form of ignoring God's command to fill the earth. In Christianity, it becomes the sin of trying to save oneself without God. In Islam, it becomes the crossing of a boundary that God Himself had set. And yet, the flood and the tower are not only linked by fear or pride, they are linked by a shared theme, the limits of human control. The flood showed that no wall of earth or stone can hold back the will of heaven. The scattering at Babel showed that no unity of speech or plan can override it either. Together, they stand as twin warnings that human strength, no matter how great, is not ultimate. Still, some storytellers wonder if the flood was a wound, could the confusion of tongues be its scar? If the flood broke the earth apart in water, Did Babel break it apart in words? And if both were divine acts, does that mean the world was meant to remain divided forever? Or could the confusion of tongues one day be healed, bringing humanity back to the unity it lost? Long after the bricks of Babel had crumbled, long after the languages had scattered into thousands of voices, whispers began to rise in some traditions about a future unlike the present. A time when the earth, divided for so long, would once again speak with one tongue. These were not the dreams of nostalgic builders, but the visions of prophets, visions that painted the end of division in colors, both bright and fearful. In Judaism, certain prophetic writings are read as hints of a day when the nations will turn to one pure speech, united in calling on the name of God. This is not the forced unity of Babel, but a harmony born from repentance and divine blessing. Where Babel's language was shattered as judgment, the coming language would be given as a gift. In Christianity, the hope of a single language is often tied to the return of Christ and the restoration of all things. It is seen as the undoing of Babel's curse, but only after the heart of humanity has been renewed. In Islam, the emphasis is different. While there is no central prophecy promising the return to one earthly tongue, the idea of unity in faith transcends language. On the day of judgment, the diversity of speech will no longer divide. All will stand under one truth, whether or not they speak the same words. Yet not all who speak of one language see it as a blessing. Some interpreters warn that a single tongue could return in the wrong way, not as a gift from heaven, but as another human attempt to rebuild Babel. In this darker vision, a common language becomes a tool for control, a way for one power to shape the thoughts of all people. In Judaism, such a forced unity would be a return to the very arrogance that brought the tower down. In Christianity, it would be a counterfeit unity, appearing whole, but hollow at the core. In Islam, it would be a sign of imbalance, a human system trying to erase the diversity God placed in the earth. The tension between these two visions, the divine gift and the human counterfeit, makes the idea of one language in the future both hopeful and dangerous. Will it be a sign of redemption or the shadow of rebellion? The answer depends on who builds it and why. Some point to moments in history when the barrier of languages seemed to lift, if only for a moment. A shared tongue in trade that spanned continents, a single language in worship that brought people from many lands to the same prayers. In Christianity, the day of Pentecost is sometimes seen as a glimpse of this future, a day when the message of God was heard in many languages at once, bridging the gap without erasing difference. In Judaism, the unity of speech in the end times is tied to a shared worship of God, not to human ambition. In Islam, the gathering of all people under one truth is not dependent on one language, but on one creator. Outside of faith, some see the rise of global languages as the beginning of this process. English, Mandarin, and Arabic carry ideas across borders. Technology translates in an instant. Some celebrate this as the reversal of Babel. Others warn that it is exactly how Babel began, with one voice growing too strong. So the prophecies leave us with a question. If the division of tongues was an act of mercy, why would heaven reverse it? If it was a curse, why has it lasted so long? And if one language is to return, will it be the voice of freedom or the sound of chains? Perhaps the best way to answer is to look at who gains from the division we now have, who benefits from the fact that the world does not speak as one. In the centuries after Babel, power often belonged to those who could cross the barriers of speech. The The scattering had divided the earth into countless tongues, but there were men and women who learned to walk between them. Some were merchants, some were envoys, and some were kings. These rulers did not see the division of languages as a curse. They saw it as a ladder, and they climbed it. In the courts of Mesopotamia, scribes were trained in multiple languages so they could record treaties, trade agreements, and royal decrees across empires. A king who could speak to many peoples was not only a ruler but a bridge, and sometimes a conqueror. In Judaism, the memory of such rulers appears in the stories of empires that rose and fell around Israel. Multilingual kings could extend their reach farther than any army because they could rule not just by the sword, but by the word. In Christianity, this skill is often seen through the lens of influence, the power to unite or deceive, depending on the heart of the ruler. In Islam, knowledge of many tongues can be a gift from God, a tool for spreading justice and truth, but also a test of humility. The Quran praises the diversity of languages as one of God's signs. A ruler who speaks many must remember that the gift is not for pride. Some rulers wore their linguistic skill like a crown. They issued decrees in 3, 4, or even 6 languages, making their rule feel inescapable. Others used translators, but still made the effort to learn key phrases, knowing that even a few words in a subject's native tongue could soften hearts or open gates. To the conquered, a king who spoke their language could be either a friend or a manipulator. To the king, the ability to stand before many nations without a wall of misunderstanding was power pure and simple. But this raises a question the faiths approach differently. Was multilingualism a blessing in the shadow of Babel, or was it a way of trying to rebuild what heaven had broken? In Judaism, the gift of languages can be used for good, but the unity of speech from Babel is remembered as dangerous. A king who gathers too much linguistic power risks repeating the same pattern. In Christianity, language skill is a neutral tool, its morality shaped entirely by the heart that uses it. In Islam, the ability to speak to many is not a return to Babel, but a reflection of the diversity God created, a sign that difference does not need to mean division. History offers examples on both sides. Alexander the Great was said to speak with soldiers and allies in their own tongues, earning loyalty across vast lands. Darius of Persia ruled through inscriptions written in multiple languages so all his subjects could read them. Yet there were others who used language to erase language, suppressing local speech in favor of a single imperial tongue. For them, multilingualism was not about connection, but control. In the modern age, the kings who spoke many tongues have been replaced by leaders, corporations, and algorithms that can translate instantly. The same power remains, the ability to bridge or to dominate. Some say this is the final undoing of Babel, the return to one global voice. Others say it is Babel reborn, with technology in place of bricks. Which leads to a deeper question. If rulers and empires have used language both to unite and to oppress, what does that mean for Babel's legacy? Did the scattering create a safeguard that kings have been dismantling ever since? Or did it plant the seeds of a richer world, one where difference could be celebrated? Perhaps to answer, we must look at a later empire whose name echoes Babel's own Babylon, and ask whether its rise was a second attempt at the tower. The ruins of Babylon rise from the dust like a memory refusing to fade. Massive walls once circled the city, their gates named for gods. The streets led to temples and palaces, and at the heart of it all stood towering structures that scraped the horizon. For some, Babylon was the jewel of Mesopotamia, a center of culture, law, and architecture. For others, it was the second shadow of Babel, another monument to human pride that would, in time, fall. The link between Babel and Babylon is more than a similarity of names. In Judaism, Babylon becomes a symbol of arrogance and exile. The destruction of the first temple and the captivity of the Jewish people in Babylon left a wound that shaped centuries of thought. Some rabbis see the city as a spiritual echo of Babel, a place that once again gathered the nations and exalted itself against God. In Christianity, Babylon becomes a symbol for every worldly power that opposes God, a recurring pattern of empire that begins with the tower and reappears until the end of time. In Islam, Babylon is remembered in connection with certain legends, including those of Harut and Marut, but it is not always directly tied to Babel. Still, the idea of a city that becomes a hub of worldly power, tempting people away from divine truth, is not far from the moral of the tower. Some historians believe that the great ziggurat of Babylon, Etemenanki, may have been the inspiration for the Babel story. Rising in stepped tiers, it was dedicated to Marduk, the chief god of the city. To the faithful of Babylon, it was a link between heaven and earth. To outsiders, it may have looked like an attempt to climb into the sky. The structure's very name, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth, sounds like a whisper from Babel's past. Yet there is a difference. Babel's builders, according to the sacred accounts, spoke one language and worked toward a single project. Babylon, by contrast, was a gathering place for many languages, many gods, many cultures. In one sense, it was the opposite of Babel's unity. In another, it was the same ambition reborn, to bring the world under one center, whether by one speech or by one throne. In Judaism, Babylon's fall is a sign that no matter how strong a city's walls or how high its towers, they cannot stand forever against God's will. In Christianity, it becomes the archetype of the great city in the book of Revelation, doomed because it trusts in its own glory. In Islam, it is a reminder that civilizations rise and fall by God's command, and that wealth and knowledge cannot save a people who turn away from truth. The echo between Babel and Babylon raises a question: are such cities doomed by their size and ambition, or by the heart that drives them? A tower can be built to honor God or to replace him. A city can welcome the nations or devour them. The stones look the same, the purpose changes everything. Today, the name Babylon is still used in poetry, music, and political speech, sometimes as a warning, sometimes as a badge of pride. To call a place Babylon is to say it is powerful, corrupt, beautiful, or dangerous, depending on who speaks. That same complexity belongs to Babel. The stories of both warn that the greatest danger to a city may not be the enemy outside its gates, but the pride within. But before we decide whether Babel was a place of worship or rebellion, we must ask, who exactly did the builders honor? Were their hands shaping a monument to the one Creator, or to gods of their own making? The tower rose in the heart of the plain, but whose name did it bear? Was it built for the glory of the one Creator, or for the worship of other gods? The answer changes with the teller, and the difference is not small. It shifts Babel from an act of devotion to an act of defiance. In Judaism, the tower is rarely described as a temple to false gods. Instead, it is seen as a monument to human pride, a statement that humanity could unite without bowing to the divine will. The rebellion was not against God in favor of idols, but against God in favor of themselves. In Christianity, the interpretation often leans toward idolatry, whether literal or symbolic. The tower becomes a shrine to human achievement, and in some traditions, It is imagined as a place where other gods were honored in defiance of the true God. In Islam, the story does not always mention idolatry in connection with Babel, but the Quran and its commentaries warn strongly against the arrogance of leaders who lead people toward worship other than God, whether through statues or through self-glorification. Archaeology adds more fuel to the debate. Many ziggurats in Mesopotamia were built as temples dedicated to deities like Marduk, Enlil, or Anu. Their stepped shapes were meant to connect the heavens and the earth, a stairway for the gods to descend and bless the city. If Babel's tower was such a ziggurat, then the case for it being a temple is strong. But the sacred texts are careful. They describe the people's ambition and their unity, but they do not always name a god they were trying to reach. This silence leaves room for centuries of interpretation. Some Jewish traditions imagine that the builders were not so much worshipping idols as trying to challenge the heavenly order itself. The tower was not for prayer, but for siege, a way to storm the heavens. In Christian thought, this can become a symbol of misplaced worship. Even if no statue stood at the top, the people had already made themselves into their own gods. In Islamic tradition, if the builder's intention was to rival or bypass God's command, then whether idols were involved or not, the act was equally corrupt. Legends outside the main scriptures paint vivid pictures. Some say the top of the tower was to be crowned with an image of the sun god, glittering with gold so it could be seen for miles. Others claim there was to be a temple fire kept burning at the summit, a light for the gods to find their way. Still others insist that the tower was a purely political project, a throne for Nimrod or whoever ruled the city, dressed in religious language to inspire loyalty. The faiths do agree on one thing: whatever the tower's purpose, it drew the eyes and hearts of the people away from the Creator. Whether that happened through idols, kings, or their own pride, the result was the same: the people trusted in something less than God. This is why, in each tradition, the tower becomes a warning not only against rebellion, but against misplaced worship. The question lingers because the details are lost. Was Babel's sin the worship of false gods, the worship of self, or the attempt to replace worship altogether with brick and mortar? If we could climb the ruins and look down from the top, would we see an altar to heaven or a throne for a man? Perhaps the answer lies not in the stones, but in the messengers who came to bring the tower down. Were they angels, servants of the divine will, sent to end the work? The day the voices broke, some say the sky was not empty. There were figures moving between the clouds and the earth, unseen by most, yet felt by all. Whether these were angels or a metaphor for divine action depends on the storyteller, but in every telling, their presence would have changed the weight of the moment. In Judaism, the role of angels at Babel is not a central part of the Torah's account, yet later rabbinic commentary sometimes imagines them as agents carrying out God's judgment. In these visions, angels descend like workers of a different kind, not to build, but to unbuild. They are not warriors striking with swords, but messengers twisting the threads of human speech until no two words match. In Christianity, the idea of angelic involvement often appears in art and sermons. Angels become the hands through which God acts, scattering the people without killing them, getting the confusion like musicians altering the notes of a song. In Islam, angels are always servants of God's command. If they were present, they acted only by His order, perhaps as witnesses or as agents who set the scattering in motion. There is no suggestion that they acted on their own or out of fear. Their role would have been purely obedience. Legends outside the core scriptures are far more dramatic. Some say angels flew around the tower's heights, striking the scaffolds and causing the bricks to fall. Others imagine them touching the tongues of the builders, replacing familiar words with strange ones. A few stories even suggest that certain angels tried to warn the people beforehand, urging them to stop before the decree came. In these versions, Babel becomes a stage where heaven's messengers plead, warn, and finally act. The faiths agree on the larger truth. If angels were there, they were not acting on their own authority. In Judaism, they would be the extension of divine justice. In Christianity, they would be the visible sign of an invisible decision. In Islam, they would be proof that no act in creation escapes the command of its creator. The difference lies in the tone. Are the angels mournful as they carry out the scattering, or are they firm and unshaken? Do they grieve for humanity's loss, or do they see only the necessity of the act? The thought of angels at Babel changes the story's scale. Without them, the confusion of tongues is an abstract act, a shift in the structure of human understanding. With them, it becomes a scene of movement and presence, beings of light walking among half-built walls, their faces calm, their voices speaking commands no mortal can hear. It adds a layer of awe, even fear, to the moment. The builders might have looked up at the sudden silence of the birds and felt a weight in the air, never knowing what stood just beyond their sight. Some imagine that the angels who scattered the people also guided them afterward. If so, then the scattering was not chaos, but a relocation. Each group led toward the land it was meant to inhabit. In this view, the angels were not only messengers of judgment, but shepherds of destiny, making sure the division led to the filling of the earth, just as God had commanded in earlier days. Still, the scriptures remain mostly silent on the details. We are left with a choice: to see Babel's scattering as a direct act of God alone, or as an act carried through by his messengers. Either way, the story moves forward, for the tongues that were broken would echo through the ages. Prophets in all three faiths would remember the tower, some as a warning, others as a lesson, others still as a sign of mercy. What lessons, then, did the prophets draw from Babel's rise and fall? Long after the dust of Babel had settled, long after the tower's walls had fallen silent, prophets spoke of its memory. They did not all tell it the same way. In their voices, Babel became a mirror, reflecting pride, warning of judgment, or showing the mercy hidden in division. Each faith remembers the tower through the words of its messengers, but the images they paint are not identical. In Judaism, prophets often speak of the dangers of pride, of nations exalting themselves above God. Babel becomes part of a larger theme. When people unite for selfish ambition, their unity becomes a weapon against righteousness. Some Jewish commentaries use Babel to explain why God scattered the nations, not to harm them, but to protect the earth from the corruption of a single power. The prophets remind their listeners that God's command to fill the earth was a blessing ignored at Babel, and that ignoring such a command invites correction. In Christianity, the tower is remembered through the lens of the heart. The prophets and apostles speak of human arrogance, of trusting in our own works rather than in God's grace. Babel becomes a symbol of what happens when we try to build a way to heaven ourselves, rather than receiving the way God provides. Some Christian teachers connect Babel to the day of Pentecost, when the barrier of languages was temporarily bridged by the Holy Spirit, a sign that God's plan is not to leave us divided forever, but to unite us in the right way at the right time. In Islam, prophets are sent to guide people away from the mistakes of those before them. While the Quran does not dwell on Babel in the same detail, the lessons it draws from similar events align closely. Pride in defying God's command brings downfall, and unity without submission to truth is a danger, not a blessing. Prophets in Islam call people to recognize that diversity of languages is a sign of God's wisdom, not an accident to be undone by human ambition. Some traditions outside the main scriptures expand the role of specific prophets in connection with Babel. In Jewish legend, certain patriarchs may have lived during or shortly after the event, their lives shaped by the scattering. In Islamic storytelling, some prophets are imagined as confronting kings like Nimrod, warning them that their plans would not stand. In Christian retellings, the prophetic voice often turns Babel into a moral parable, pointing to the dangers of building anything, a city, a nation, a life, without the foundation of humility before God. What is striking is that while the words of the prophets differ in tone and emphasis, the threads are familiar. Pride is dangerous. Unity can be holy or deadly depending on its purpose. Division can be a curse or a mercy depending on who orders it. The prophet's task was not to settle the contradictions, but to keep the questions alive so that each generation would wrestle with them. And wrestle we still do. Was Babel's scattering meant to protect humanity from the kind of violence that once brought the flood? Was it the birth of the nations, or simply one of many moments when people spread across the earth? The prophets leave space for both answers, as if knowing that the truth may not fit into one voice, one language. The scattering's role in the origin of nations is our next question. Did every culture and people begin at Babel's fall, or were the seeds of difference planted long before the tower touched the sky? When the voices of the builders broke into 1,000 sounds, the earth itself seemed to shift. Families who once shared every word could no longer trade a sentence without confusion. Groups huddled together, clinging to those they could still understand. Soon, the circles widened into paths, and the paths became journeys. The scattering was not just about language, it was about identity, and from those identities, the nations began. In Judaism, Babel is often remembered as the moment when humanity split into distinct peoples. The genealogies in sacred tradition trace the spread of Noah's descendants into many lands, each taking with them their new tongue. The scattering fulfills God's earlier command to fill the earth, a command the builders had resisted. It was not simply exile, it was the planting of human diversity across the globe. In Christianity, the tower is tied to the same idea, but with an added layer. The unity lost at Babel is something God will one day restore, not by erasing the nations, but by bringing them together in a redeemed harmony. In Islam, while Babel itself is not always centered as the birthplace of all nations, the Quran affirms that God made humanity into nations and tribes so that they might know one another. Diversity is framed as intentional, a sign of divine wisdom rather than a tragic accident. Yet not all agree that Babel was the sole starting point. Some traditions suggest that cultural differences existed long before the tower fell, and that the scattering only deepened them. Archaeology and anthropology point to varied languages, customs, and settlements that may have predated any such event. If that is true, then Babel was not the birth of nations, but a turning point, a sudden acceleration of differences already underway. The image of nations being born in a single moment is powerful. It explains why languages differ, why customs clash, why the earth feels both shared and divided, but it also raises questions. If diversity began at Babel, was it meant to be permanent, or was it a temporary measure until humanity could be trusted with unity again? In Judaism, the permanence of nations is part of the order of the world, even as the prophets speak of a future gathering. In Christianity, Babel's division is healed in part through faith, which can unite across borders without erasing them. In Islam, diversity remains a sign of God's design, lasting until the end of days when all return to Him. Some legends describe the moment of scattering in vivid detail. Groups leaving the plane carried the memory of the tower in different ways. One people told the story as a warning against ambition, another as a reminder to never lose their language again, another barely spoke of it at all, as if to let the memory fade. These first stories became the seeds of culture, shaping how each group saw itself and the world. Over generations, the paths taken from Babel became trade routes, borders, and maps. What began as an act of divine intervention turned into the tapestry of human civilization. Yet woven into that tapestry is the question of origins. Are we many because we were meant to be, or because we failed to remain one? The ruins of the tower do not answer. The voices of the nations still speak in different tongues. And so we look back toward the plain, wondering if any trace of the tower survives. Could the bricks still lie beneath the sands, waiting to be found? If we searched for the last brick of Babel, would we find it? The tower may be gone, but the hunt for its remains has never truly stopped. From the deserts of Iraq to the riverbanks of ancient Mesopotamia, explorers, archaeologists, and dreamers have all asked the same question. Could any part of Babel still be standing? Somewhere beneath the sands, under centuries of dust and wind, might there be a single brick that once reached toward the sky? The search begins in the land between the Tigris and the Euphrates. Here, ancient ziggurats rise like broken steps toward heaven. One of the most famous, Etemenanki in Babylon, has long been a candidate. Archaeologists have uncovered its foundations, layers of sun-dried brick bound with bitumen, its base so massive it could have supported a structure of dizzying height. In Judaism, such ruins are sometimes linked to the memory of Babel, though the exact match is debated. In Christianity, Etemenanki is often imagined as either the tower itself or a descendant of its design. In Islam, the physical search is less central. The lesson of Babel does not rely on finding the tower, but some still find meaning in tracing its possible location. Other candidates lie scattered across Mesopotamia. The ziggurat of Ur, though smaller, carries the same architectural style. Ruins in Borsippa, with inscriptions boasting of restoration by later kings, bear uncanny similarities to Babel's legendary design. Each site offers just enough evidence to tempt belief: bricks with ancient stamps, fragments of ceremonial staircases, remnants of bitumen mortar that still smells faintly of tar when broken open. Legends speak of lone bricks kept as relics, passed down through generations. In one tale, a single stone from Babel was kept in a royal treasury as a warning against defying heaven. In another, a brick was said to have been taken far away, carried by a family that left the plain and became the founders of a distant nation. Such stories blur the line between history and myth, but they keep the hope alive that the tower's remains are more than dust. For some, the search is not about finding an object, but about finding proof. If the last brick of Babel could be uncovered, it might silence the skeptics or force the faithful to see the story in a new light. For others, the mystery is the point. The absence of the tower forces each generation to wrestle with its meaning, not its measurements. In Judaism, finding the tower's remains could serve as a tangible reminder of the dangers of pride and the reality of God's intervention. In Christianity, it might deepen the contrast between the failed Tower of Babel and the enduring city of God. In Islam, even if a brick were found, it would not alter the core truth that God's will, not human architecture, shapes history. Some archaeologists quietly doubt that anything recognizable could survive. Mud brick weathers quickly. Without constant repair, it returns to dust in a few centuries. If Babel was truly abandoned in a single moment, the tower might have eroded within a few generations. But others argue that somewhere beneath the layers of time, preserved under collapse, something could remain: a corner of a wall, a foundation stone, a final brick untouched since the day the voices fell silent. And so the search continues, not only in the ground but in the mind. Because even if the last brick is never found, the image of it is enough to stir questions. Who held it last? Did they lay it with hope, defiance, or fear? And if the brick is still out there, what might it tell us about the people who built it, and about what happened to them after the scattering? Perhaps the answer lies in the lives of those who walked away from Babel and carried its memory with them. When the voices broke and the city emptied, not everyone disappeared into the same blur of history. Some names, some families linger in the stories, remembered as those who carried their power, their skill, or their language through the chaos. These are the survivors of the scattering, the ones who did not vanish completely into the tide of nations. In some Jewish traditions, the confusion of tongues was not total. A few families are said to have kept their original speech, a gift or a mercy granted by God. They could still speak to one another as before, even as the rest of the world stumbled into misunderstanding. In certain interpretations, these groups held an advantage in the days after Babel, able to organize, to trade, and to preserve knowledge more easily than others. In Christianity, the idea of survivors with an unbroken language is sometimes told as a symbol that even in judgment, God leaves a thread of continuity, a way for his purposes to move forward. In Islam, while the focus is less on preserved tongues and more on divine decree, the scattering is complete. All are touched by it. Yet survival, in the sense of guidance and protection, still belongs to those who remain faithful. Legends fill in the gaps the scriptures leave. Some say that the rulers or master builders of Babel kept their speech, using it to lead their followers into new lands where they could rebuild their cities. Others imagine wandering sages who carried the old language as a secret, passing it down to chosen students. In some tellings, the survivors became the founders of powerful nations, their advantage in communication allowing them to grow quickly while others struggled to adapt. But survival was not only about language, it was also about knowledge. The techniques for shaping bricks, the designs for lifting heavy stones, the methods of irrigation, all were at risk of being lost when the builders scattered. Groups who managed to carry these skills intact became centers of influence in their new homes. Some built smaller towers, temples, and fortresses reminiscent of Babel. Others abandoned the idea of building high altogether, turning their talents toward farming, trade, or navigation. There is a tension in the way the faiths remember these survivors. In Judaism, preserving the original language could be seen as a blessing, but it also came with a warning. The same unity that led to pride could do so again. In Christianity, the survival of a language or skill might be providential, but it does not erase the need for humility before God. In Islam, survival is less about privilege and more about purpose. Those who endured did so under the plan of God, not by their own cleverness. Some storytellers take the idea further, suggesting that the survivors of Babel might one day use what they preserved to bring the nations back together. Depending on the heart behind it, this could be a restoration of harmony or a return to the arrogance that caused the scattering. This uncertainty mirrors the entire Babel story. Is unity the dream to pursue or the danger to avoid? We may never know exactly who these survivors were or where they went. Their names have faded into legend, their cities into dust. But the thought that some walked away from Babel with their language, their skills, and their ambitions intact adds another layer to the story. It means Babel did not end in total loss, and it means the seeds of its ambition may have been carried into the future. If that is true, then Babel is not just one story among many. It belongs to a pattern of divine judgments in history, moments when heaven steps into human plans and changes their course. How does Babel compare to those other great acts of intervention? The scattering at Babel was not the first time heaven had stepped in to halt human plans, and it would not be the last. Across the sacred histories of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, there are other moments when divine judgment fell upon the earth, moments of fire, flood, plague, and destruction. Yet Babel stands apart, not because it was greater in scale, but because it was different in nature. It was a punishment without bodies falling, a judgment that left the city standing, but its purpose broken. In Judaism, Babel sits alongside the flood, Sodom and Gomorrah, and the plagues of Egypt as examples of God's intervention in human affairs. Yet where the flood swept away nearly all life and Sodom was turned to ash, Babel's end was quieter. No waters rose, no fire fell, only the sudden fracture of human understanding. Some rabbis note that this difference reveals a deeper mercy. The builders were corrected, not destroyed. In Christianity, Babel is often compared to other divine judgments to highlight its restraint. The flood washed the earth clean, Babel simply rearranged it. The fire of Sodom consumed, Babel scattered. It is discipline rather than annihilation, a sign that God's justice can be swift without being final. In Islam, the scattering is seen in the same way, a decisive act by God to set the world in the order He intended, without wiping out those who strayed from it. Yet in each tradition, the comparison to harsher punishments invites a question. Why was Babel spared destruction? Was the sin of the tower less severe than those of earlier generations, or was the method of judgment chosen to fit the crime? In Judaism, the answer often leans toward the latter. The builders' pride was met with the loss of the very thing they valued most, their unity. In Christianity, Babel's sin is serious, but the scattering offers a second chance. In Islam, it is not about severity in human terms. The form of judgment was simply the form that fulfilled God's will. The nature of Babel's punishment also shapes how we remember it. The flood's devastation is easy to picture, waves swallowing the earth. The fire that fell on Sodom is vivid in its violence, but the confusion of tongues is subtler. It happens in the mind, in the mouth, in the ear. It does not leave a smoking crater, only a silence where understanding used to be. And yet, that silence was powerful enough to stop the tower where it stood. Some storytellers argue that Babel was, in its way, more effective than the harsher punishments. Floodwaters recede, ashes cool, but the division of languages has lasted for thousands of years. The builders never regrouped. The tower was never finished. The punishment is still in force today, a reminder every time two strangers fail to understand each other's words. Others see Babel's gentler touch as a sign that it was not purely punishment at all, but a redirection. The flood erased, Babel redirected. If the tower had been completed, it might have led to greater harm, but instead, humanity was sent outward, filling the earth as originally intended. In this view, Babel belongs not with the great punishments, but with the great corrections, a moment when God's hand guided history without crushing it. Still, the question lingers. Could Babel happen again? Could there be another moment in our age when heaven would step in, not with fire or flood, but with a change so deep it would reshape the way we speak, think, and live? The modern world, with its technology and global reach, is closer to one language than it has been since the plain of Shinar. And if unity without humility was dangerous then, what would it mean now? In the plain of Shinar, the people had one language, one project, one ambition. Today, the world is not so different. The languages are still many, but the gaps between them are closing. Translation happens in an instant. Voices from one side of the planet can be heard on the other, and information travels faster than caravans ever could. For some, this is the triumph of human progress. For others, it is the shadow of Babel returning. In Judaism, the story of Babel warns that unity is not automatically good. Its value depends on the purpose it serves. A world drawn together by technology and commerce must still ask, are we building for the sake of each other or for the sake of our own pride? In Christianity, the growing interconnection of the globe can be read as either a gift or a danger. It can be the means by which truth and compassion spread more quickly, or the stage for another attempt to climb to heaven without God. In Islam, the rise of global communication is not inherently a threat, but it is a reminder that human plans must remain under divine guidance. Unity that ignores God's will is the same mistake the builders of Babel made, no matter how advanced the tools. Our modern bricks are not clay and bitumen, they are circuits, satellites, and code. Instead of a tower, we build networks, servers, and skyscrapers of glass and steel. We speak to each other across oceans without leaving our homes. We share images and words in real time. The dream of one voice feels within reach again, and with it, the same questions Babel raises. Is this the path to peace or the road to arrogance? Some celebrate the end of linguistic and cultural barriers as the undoing of Babel's curse. Machines can translate nearly any tongue. Education and media create common references that cross national borders. A shared digital space allows people to unite in ways the builders of Babel could never have imagined. But others see the danger. One language can be used to share truth, but it can also be used to spread lies. One voice can call for justice, but it can also call for conquest. The greater the unity, the greater the risk if that unity turns toward the wrong goal. History has shown that large-scale human cooperation can achieve wonders, curing diseases, ending conflicts, sending machines beyond the stars. But it has also shown that the same unity can bring devastation, world wars, mass surveillance, weapons that can destroy cities in seconds. The tower is not always made of stone. Sometimes it is built of ideas, systems, and ambitions too large for wisdom to contain. In Judaism, the lesson for the present is to guard the purpose behind our unity. In Christianity, it is to remember that true unity begins with humility before God. In Islam, it is to recognize that diversity is part of God's design and that forcing one language or system on all humanity risks repeating Babel's arrogance. The technology may be new, but the heart of the matter is ancient. We may not see angels descending to scatter our speech, But history shows that when human pride grows unchecked, something always comes to halt it, whether through conflict, collapse, or change we did not foresee. The question is whether we will choose to guide our unity toward good, or whether we will wait for it to be broken for us. And as the world draws closer together, some wonder if our time mirrors the days before the tower fell. If so, could the next great shift be one foretold by prophecy, the return to a single language in the end times? Across the three faiths, visions of the end of days speak of a world transformed, but they do not all agree on whether that transformation will bring a return to one language. The idea is both hopeful and unsettling. If the scattering at Babel was an act of mercy, then the restoration of a single tongue could be a sign of redemption. But if it was a safeguard against human pride, then the same event could be the beginning of the final rebellion. In Judaism, some prophetic writings are read as promises that the nations will one day be united in a pure speech, all calling on the name of God together. This is not the human-forged unity of Babel, but a divine gift, a language cleansed of arrogance, spoken by hearts turned toward heaven. It is a reversal of Babel's division, but on heaven's terms. In Christianity, similar imagery appears in visions of the kingdom of God, where people from every tribe and language gather before the throne in harmony. Whether they speak one restored language or simply understand each other perfectly is left to mystery, but the unity is clear. In Islam, the focus in the end times is less on language itself and more on unity under the truth. On the day of judgment, the diversity of tongues will no longer divide humanity. All will answer to one Lord, no matter their words. Yet the same idea can carry a darker meaning. Some interpreters warn that a single global language before the end could be a counterfeit, a human attempt to reclaim Babel's power without its wisdom. In this reading, the one tongue is not a blessing from above, but a tool of control, part of a system that gathers the nations under a leader or order opposed to God. In Judaism, such false unity could echo the arrogance of the tower's builders. In Christianity, it might be seen as part of the deception of the Antichrist. In Islam, it could signal a time of great trial when the faithful must hold to truth even as the world unites against it. Some point to modern technology as a step toward this possibility. Translation software, global media, and the dominance of certain languages in politics and trade could be paving the way for a shared speech. Whether this will serve peace or pride depends, as always, on the heart of those who use it. History shows that shared language does not guarantee shared values. The tension between the hopeful and the ominous readings of one language in the end times mirrors the tension at the heart of Babel's story. Unity can be the tool of redemption or the weapon of rebellion. The difference lies in who builds it and for what purpose. If the last days bring a single tongue, we may find ourselves back at the plain of Shinar, but with the choice laid bare. Will we raise a tower to our own name, or will we speak as one in honor of the one who gave us speech? And if the end times are less about the return to one language than about the meaning we give to many, then the real question is not what we speak, but what remains when the echoes of Babel fade. Which brings us to the final chapter, the lesson left hanging. Babel's story ends without a neat conclusion. The tower is left unfinished, the people are scattered, and the questions it raises are never fully answered. Perhaps that is why it lingers so powerfully, because it refuses to resolve into a single moral. Each faith, each generation, each storyteller finds a different lesson in its dust. In Judaism, Babel stands as a warning about the danger of unity without obedience. It reminds the people that God's command to fill the earth was not a suggestion. When humanity chose to ignore it, He acted to make it happen. The scattering was not merely judgment, it was a return to the path that had been set from the beginning. In Christianity, the tower becomes a parable about the heart, a lesson that no amount of human effort can bridge the gap to God. The unity humanity seeks must be built on humility and faith, not ambition and pride. In Islam, the event is a sign of God's absolute authority. No matter how strong or united people may be, they cannot outbuild, outthink, or outrun His will. And yet Babel is not only about what went wrong. Hidden within its ruins are glimpses of what could be right. Unity is not condemned outright. It is simply shown to be dangerous when divorced from truth. Diversity is not a curse. It is a design that carries both challenge and beauty. The tension between these two truths is the heartbeat of the story. Humanity is meant to be connected, but not in ways that replace or defy the Creator. Some see Babel's scattering as the seed of all conflict, a permanent wound in human history. Others see it as the foundation of culture, language, and identity. Without it, there would be no variety of song or story, no tapestry of tongues, no richness of difference. The question is whether we can ever hold diversity and unity together without repeating Babel's mistake. The lesson is left hanging because the story leaves us in the middle of history. We live between the scattering and whatever comes next, between Babel and the possibility of its reversal. The unfinished tower still casts its shadow over our cities, our politics, our technology, and our dreams. Every time we gather in one voice, we walk the fine line between harmony and hubris. Every time we drift into isolation, we risk losing the strength that comes from being one. Babel forces us to ask hard questions about our ambitions. Are we building to honor God or to honor ourselves? Are we seeking unity to serve others or to control them? Are we celebrating diversity as a gift or using it as an excuse for division? The answers change with the age, but the questions do not fade. And so the story does not tell us what to decide. It hands us the bricks, the mortar, and the memory, and waits to see what we will build, which leads us into the final reflection, the place where all the contradictions gather and the mystery of Babel remains alive. The plain of Shinar is quiet now. The voices that once rose in one song are gone, replaced by the whisper of wind over sand. But if you listen closely, you can still hear something, not words, but the rhythm of building. It beats in the hearts of every generation. The tower never truly ended. It simply changed its shape. In Judaism, Babel remains a living warning. Every time a nation gathers too much power or tries to erase the boundaries God set, it is as if the first brick of Babel is being laid again. The scattering was a single event, but the temptation it answered repeats endlessly. In Christianity, the tower is a mirror of the soul's struggle. We are always building our lives, our reputations, our dreams. The question is whether our construction is for God's glory or our own. In Islam, the story remains a reminder that all plans succeed or fail by God's will alone. The lesson is as relevant now as it was in the time of the first builders. No height of ambition can overtop the decree of the Creator. The tower that never ends does not always rise in stone. Sometimes it is a political empire stretching across continents. Sometimes it is a network of technology binding the world into one vast system. Sometimes it is the idea that humanity can solve every problem without the guidance of the one who gave it life. These towers may never scrape the clouds, but they reach just as far in their ambition. And yet not every tower is doomed. The story of Babel does not condemn building, only building with the wrong heart. The same unity that was dangerous on the plain of Shinar can be holy when it is rooted in humility. The same diversity that began as a division can be a gift when it is embraced with gratitude. The challenge is not to choose between unity and diversity, but to hold them in balance under God's design. This is why Babel's mystery remains. It is not a closed case. We are still living inside its echo. Every time the world draws closer together, we face the same decision the builders faced. What will we do with our unity? Every time we drift apart, we face the same challenge the scattered faced. Will we remember that we are still one human family? The ruins on the plain may be buried, but the tower stands in every age. We rebuild it in our cities, in our systems, in our minds. Some days we climb it to reach toward heaven. Some days we build it to hide from the flood we fear will come again. The stones change, the mortar changes, but the impulse is the same. So the story ends without an ending. Babel is both behind us and ahead of us. We inherit its languages, its questions, and its choice. And perhaps that is the point, that the tower never ends because its true foundation is not in the earth, but in the human heart. As long as we can dream of building higher, we will have to decide whose name we carve into the top. The wind still moves over the plain. Somewhere, perhaps under centuries of sand, the last brick of the first tower waits. But the greater tower, the one made of our pride, our hope, our longing to be more than we are, needs no excavation. It is already here. The question is not whether it will fall, but who will decide what is built next.